Hello, all you positive heads out there. It's so good to be back with all you beautiful reflections of the one source consciousness that creates and animates all things. If you're new to this podcast, of course, we're super happy to have you here. And if you've been listening and enjoying for a while, I would be super grateful if you would please take a moment to give us a review on Apple Podcasts. It's one of the best and simplest ways to pay it forward and help others find the show so that they too can tap into the powerful perspectives and positive vibrations we are collectively emanating. The other unique and magical way to share this show is by sending any friends you think would benefit from listening to this podcast our Game with the Universe link at positivehead.com/game. Also listed in the show notes, which will serve them up a quote-unquote random episode when they click it. Just instruct them before clicking the link to close their eyes for a moment and sincerely ask the universe to queue up the episode that contains the insight and perspectives that they most need to hear at this point in their life journey, and then click to listen to whatever episode is synchronistically served up to them. I have heard time and time again from people about the incredible results they received playing the game. So just tell your friends magical results are guaranteed or their karma back. All right, all you positive heads. On this week's SoulShare episode, I'm very excited to have Daniel Lieberman here with me on the show. Daniel is a clinical professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at George Washington University and author of Spellbound, Modern Science, Ancient Magic, and the Hidden Potential of the Unconscious Mind. Hello, Dan. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, looking forward to this. When I first learned about the book, I was very excited to have you on. This is such a wonderful topic, near and dear to myself and the listeners, so excited to dive in. But before we do, I would like to start with my cliche opening question, which is this. You're in an elevator. The woman next to you looks over, says, "What's your passion?" You have 10 floors to answer. What do you say?
Wow, that's a tough one. What is my passion? I know what that is. My passion is bringing the most fascinating ideas to the general public. I love to teach. I love to share my excitement about these things. And I love to see the response when people go, "Oh my goodness, I never realized that before, but it's so important."
Love that. Well, if you would, Dan, give us a little bit of your backstory, whatever feels relevant to share in the context of our conversation, about the book and all things magic and conscious, unconscious mind. How did you get to the point of writing something like this?
Well, I think I can take it back to when I was in high school and I took the PSAT. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, I do.
And so what happens after you take the PSAT? You get all of this marketing material from colleges that want you to come to see them.
Is that what happens? You must have gotten a lot better score than that. I don't remember that.
So, I got all this stuff, and you see the pictures of the library and the campus and all of this propaganda. But I got one that was very different, and that was from a school called St. John's College. St. John's College is a great books education. There are no tests. There are no textbooks. There are no lectures.
Wow.
What you do for the entire 4 years is you read the great books, starting with the ancient Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, the Iliad, the Odyssey.
Oh my gosh, my son would love this college. He's actually applying to Juilliard and in like his final, the final crew to be determined if he gets in. And
oh my gosh,
I'm gonna have to tell him about face, he is so into all the great books. So I got to tell him about this. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
So so what they sent me was just simply a list of the books that you're going to read. And I looked at that list and I said, you know what? I need to read every single one of these books because they contain the most exciting, most important ideas of Western civilization. So for the next 4 years, I was exposed to these amazing ideas. And I realized I wanted to spend my life studying the human mind. Wasn't sure how I was going to do it. Didn't feel a whole lot of urgency. I was young, graduated, didn't know what I wanted to do, didn't have a job. And a classmate who was Japanese said, "You know what? Why don't you go to Japan?" This was in the mid 80s. It was the bubble economy in Japan. Their export industry was absolutely taking off. And he said, any American with a college degree can get a job teaching English right off the airplane. So being young and impulsive, I bought a one-way ticket, convinced my roommate to come with me. We had a wonderful time. While I was there, I picked up a book by Carl Jung, Man and His Symbols. And it kind of blew my mind. I encountered so many of the ideas I had in the great books, but now from a psychological perspective, talking about how it is that the human brain evolves these amazing philosophical, religious, and mystical ideas. Yeah. I decided to become a psychiatrist, to study the human mind, and my desire to write about Jung and the mystical aspects of psychology was born. And it took me decades before I finally felt that I was ready to do it.
Wow. What a cool journey. And so now you've went deep down that rabbit hole, and you actually, this is your second book?
Mm-hmm. That's
that correct?
Right. Yeah.
And the first one, The Molecule of More.
About dopamine.
Dopamine. Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear a little bit about that too. We can kind of put them in either order, whatever you think would flow the best. But I guess you
let's
decide.
Talk about dopamine briefly. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
The Molecule of More was the first book I wrote. I was at at George Washington University for 26 years as a full-time faculty member. And as you can imagine, I wrote all kinds of scientific papers.
Yeah.
And those are hard to write. They can take 2 or 3 years to gather data, analyze the data, and then write up the results. And then if you're lucky, a few dozen people will read them.
Right. Ow.
And, I spent my lifeblood cranking out these papers, climbing the academic ladder. When I finally reached professor, I said, all right, now I want to write something that people are actually going to read and enjoy. That kind of thing gets absolutely no respect in academia, which is why I had to wait so long. So I said, I'm going to write about dopamine because that is the single most interesting thing I know. I had done some work with addictions. I had done work with ADHD. And as I started reading the background material for this book, I realized just how influential dopamine was over so many aspects of our lives, that it's an incredibly powerful force within our mind, powerful for good, also powerful for destruction. And so it was really about trying to make people realize that to some degree, they are at the mercy of their neuroanatomy, their neurophysiology. And it really resonated with people. A lot of people wrote back and said, wow, this is so helpful. This makes me feel like I can take a step back from my brain, see how it's working, and use it better as a tool. That was dopamine in The Molecule of More. Spellbound takes that to the next level. Spellbound talks about how the vast majority of our mental life is outside of our control. It goes on in our unconscious mind. It is enormously sophisticated. And I think one of the fundamental aspects of a life well lived is learning about your unconscious mind, coming to terms with it, and making it your ally.
Yeah, that makes sense. This reminds me, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dr. Bruce Lipton. I had him on the show years ago, and he talks a lot about this. And, that I forget there's some statistical information regarding conscious mind processing versus unconscious mind processing, and it's insane.
1 to 500,000. The unconscious mind processes 500,000 times more information per second than the conscious mind. Yeah, it's a big difference.
Yeah, and yet we are paying so much attention to what's happening on the conscious, surface
Almost
level, right?
Exclusively, yeah.
Wow.
It's a mistake. It's a mistake. We're really not doing our brains justice by doing that.
You sort of refer to it as the uncontrollable part of the brain or instinct. And so if you could elaborate, I mean, that just hearing that, those two things, okay, 500,000 to one, and it's uncontrollable and instinct, like it sort of doesn't paint a pretty picture. So could you speak to that?
We, as we get older, especially, we accept the fact that we're not in full control of our bodies.
Yeah.
It's a little bit harder to accept the fact that we're not in control of our minds.
Mm-hmm.
We think that we can think about whatever we want. I can think about what I'm going to make for dinner. I can think about a sea manatee or whatever it is. But in fact, the vast majority of what goes on inside our minds is outside of our control. Now, that can be something very, very basic, very primitive, like the part of our brain that controls our heart rate and our breathing rate.
Right.
It can be a little bit more sophisticated. The parts of our brain that generate emotion, or it can be enormously sophisticated. The parts of our brain that generate intuition, even inspiration, ideas that come out of the blue that can change our lives, sometimes change the course of history. Now, I think characterizing it as instinct is a good way to understand it, but it's important to have a caveat there. And that is, we have to be very careful not to label instinct as primitive. In some ways, instinct is primitive. It's the animal part of the way we think. But instinct can also be enormously sophisticated. And we know that by looking at the instincts of animals. Jung likes to talk about the weaver bird that makes this enormously complex nest that's all woven together. It doesn't have to be taught how to do that. That's instinct.
Yeah.
Ant colonies are farmers and ranchers. They raise crops. They ranch aphids, which produce a sugary syrup that they feed on. And they protect the aphid brood. They lead them to their food. And again, they don't have to be taught this. They don't have to learn this. This is encoded within their DNA. Now, humans, of course, have much more complex brains than weaver birds or ants. And so one would expect that our instincts would be proportionately more complex, and they absolutely are. In fact, our instincts are so complex that our conscious mind is not capable of understanding them. Jung called these instincts archetypes, and they represent the essential themes of human thought. The bones of the plot of the stories that we tell, the characters that we find cropping up again and again in folklore, fairy tales, mythology, and literature. And these archetypes are so big, so powerful, and so complex, the conscious mind can't conceive of them, only little tiny pieces at a time.
Yeah. Wow. So, you know, as I just kind of ponder what you're just saying, the different levels of the unconscious. I mean, then you start talking about emotions and intuition and some of these things. Also, how that gets very complex. And would you say that like emotions are also part of the unconscious mind as
Yeah,
well?
absolutely. Anything that we don't have conscious control over, and those things can be enormously beneficial. The unconscious mind can be the most valuable ally imaginable. It can also be incredibly destructive.
Yeah,
And let's take a look at emotions. The emotions that you experience largely determine the quality of your day, right?
for sure.
It doesn't matter if amazing things happen to you. If you're having a bad day and you're sad, it's a horrible day. By the same token, it doesn't matter if from the outside it looks like horrible things are happening to you. You get stuck in a traffic jam. You lose your cell phone, whatever. If you're in a good mood, it's a fantastic day.
Right.
We do things that try to make it more likely that we'll be happy. We plan activities, go to a movie, go on a picnic. We buy things that we think will make us happy. And these do have an effect, but it's not a direct effect, nor is the effect guaranteed. You
Hmm.
could spend $10,000 on your dream vacation and
Mm-hmm.
not have a good time,
Right.
right? You
Right.
could be dreading going to some event and have the best time that you've had all month.
Right.
Um, so emotions are enormously important, out of our control. We can have wonderful positive emotions. We can sometimes feel this surge of generosity when someone else is in need and change the course of somebody's life. On
Yeah.
the other hand, we can be overcome by rage and we can smash prized possessions and say incredibly hurtful things to the people that we care about most.
Right.
And so the unconscious mind can be very, very dangerous. It's easy for eruptions to take over our lives and either hurt us or help us in profound ways.
Yeah. Would you say that, you know, emotions are more unconscious than conscious? Because, one of the things that I've done in my own journey is work on, controlling those emotions, which I'm aware of on the surface and can observe when I'm getting agitated or, in that sort of state that is, if it's like, if my aim is to be at peace in all situations and I'm finding myself, experiencing emotions that aren't peaceful and then consciously choosing to shift those, I mean, it sort of rides the line between both, right? Because you kind of bring it to your conscious awareness, and then that gives you some level of control. Is that sort of the aim? Would you say?
Yeah, I would say that's absolutely right. Carl Jung believed that one of the most important activities of growth is making the unconscious conscious.
Right.
So emotions start in the unconscious. They start in a place that we're not aware of.
Right.
And then they push themselves upwards to the place where they potentially can become conscious. We can choose to pay attention or not.
Yeah. So I'm curious whether you reference in your book modern science, which we're talking about here, and then ancient magic and hidden potential of the unconscious mind. So I'm curious, where you think these unconscious instincts and emotions and so forth are coming from in a sort of from a mystical perspective, if you would.
Yeah. Um, you know, I wrote this book because I was fascinated with these ancient mystical traditions.
Hmm.
And I thought of myself as an educated person. I'd done a lot of reading, but I realized this was an area that I was really quite ignorant about, and
Hmm.
I wanted to share my excitement and bring it to a wider audience. But I wanted to approach it from a scientific standpoint because I think that the vast majority of people, when they hear about these mystical things, not your listeners, of course, but most people, they put up barriers
Yep.
and they say, "Well, I prefer a scientific approach to the world. I'm not so sure about the existence of the
Hmm.
metaphysical."
Right.
So I kind of wanted to say, "Okay, fine. Let's do it from a scientific standpoint because we can."
Yeah.
And so, from a scientific standpoint, these mystical forces came from evolution.
Mm.
For one reason or another, viewing the world from a mystical perspective increased our evolutionary ancestors' fitness. It made it easier for us to survive. It
Mm.
made it easier for us to cooperate in large groups, which is really the key to human being survival, that
Hmm.
ability to form social units.
Yeah.
So I would say that there are two ways of looking at this. We can look at it from the materialist model and say these things are coming out of unconscious circuits that were built by evolution.
Hmm. Yeah. Wow. So that's an interesting point, because I often say when we're talking about the mystical and spiritual sort of concepts, it's like, everyone's has varying degrees of, intelligence. And usually, no matter what their intelligence, they're going to decide for themselves what they feel and what's true and what's not for them, based off their perspective on everything. And I always say, and that's great. We should do that. And what's interesting about a lot of these, mystical concepts that I've found is when I apply some of these perspectives to my life around the idea that, I'm one with the source consciousness that creates and animates all things. Okay, what if I act and live from that perspective? What results does it get me? And what I'm hearing when you say that is like, oh, by applying these unconscious ideas about the mystical and, beyond the veil of physicality, so to speak, the results that it has gotten humanity is a net positive, ultimately.
That's right. It's not a good idea to fight your own biology. For whatever reason, the brain is wired to see the world in a mystical way. When my car is reluctant to start in the morning, I talk to it. And I say, come on, help me out. You really got right.
That's pretty mystical.
I treat it as if it had a soul. When the copy machine misbehaves, I want to give it a punch because I naturally, instinctively feel as if it is alive. I instinctively feel as if everything around me is alive. I usually am not consciously aware of that feeling. And when I am, I'm tempted to say, oh, it's a metaphorical way of thinking about it. But, let's compare it to the way we think about physics, okay? So, I've got my coffee cup here on my desk, which is made out of a piece of solid wood, right? Wrong. This wood is not solid. This wood is 99.999% empty space.
Right.
I know that, but I don't go around telling myself you're wrong for thinking that matter is solid, because my brain evolved for me to see wood as solid, and so that's the best way to do it. And I think the same is true with mysticism. Although it's a little bit uncomfortable for modern people, we have to recognize that when we work with our brain's biology, from a practical standpoint, as you said, we're going to be more successful with our lives.
This is a really interesting argument and perspective on why to give, credence to the mystical. I think I mentioned my son earlier, and one of his best friends since high school, who's very, atheist, and it's, very hard and fast science that, that's BS. And it's like, what an interesting thing to present to someone like that. Like, oh, well, do you want to work with your biology and get the best results out of life? Then you probably want to take another look here. That's not an argument. As someone who loves all the angles, that's not one I've ever thought of or heard, and I really like it. Very, very cool. So, yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear a little bit more from you on the connection between the unconscious and the supernatural, paranormal, and what your deep dive. I love that you're looking at both lenses, science and the mystical side of things. In your own journey, what is the connection that you found with this approach?
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about how contents within the unconscious can erupt into consciousness. We can become aware of emotions, intuitions, inspirations. Sometimes it erupts in the form of artistic expression. But the unconscious can also be projected onto the outside world. And that's the reason why I talk to my car. My car's probably not alive. There's, as a good scientist, I have to say there's no way I can know for sure. That can't be measured, but probably not. I'm probably projecting my internal contents onto it.
But is it, let me just interject real quickly.
Yeah.
The way I would look at it is yes, from what we consider a live standpoint, okay, what we would typically say is alive, it would classify as not. And if you're looking at things through this sort of mystical perspective, at least one similar to the way I do, that there is no out there. It's reflecting me back to me in some way, shape, or form. And therefore, by virtue of my aliveness, it is imbued in the thing I'm interacting with, the car, the
Yeah.
computer, the coffee cup. It's, and then you start to notice the patterns when I'm in an agitated state. All of a sudden, my computer's glitching out.
Yeah.
And so you start, one thing that humans are really good at is pattern recognition. And you start
Yes.
recognizing those sorts of patterns. It's like, hold on, there's a connection here in some way. And so, it's sort of in a proxy way, it's alive through us, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, okay. I like that. I like that. As I mentioned, the key to human beings' survival is our ability to work in groups. If you look at the tribal size of pre-human primates and the size of their brain, there's a direct connection. The brain gets bigger, the number of people who are able to cooperate gets bigger.
Mm,
And scientists believe that's why we have a tendency toward animism, viewing inanimate objects as being ensouled, because
mm,
our brains were designed for social relationships. And
mm-hmm,
so we have social relationships, not just with other people, but also with our coffee cup and our washing machine and our automobile.
mm.
That's the beginning of mysticism, seeing the
Stuffed animals all of a sudden make sense.
yeah, yeah. That's the beginning of mysticism. Now, let's go a little bit deeper. Let's take a look at the pagan gods. One of the things that is notable about the pagan gods is that most of them have an animal aspect to them. They're theriomorphic. That's the
Mm,
technical term.
mm,
And that's a reflection that the unconscious, which is being projected, is the animal part of our humanity.
mm.
Why would animals be gods? In some ways,
Hmm.
animals seem lower than humans, but
Right.
but they're not. Animals have superhuman strength. They have
Mm-hmm.
superhuman cunning. They have superhuman patience. Another thing that the unconscious animals and pagan gods all have in common is that they are amoral. They are neither good nor evil.
Mm,
A lion that kills someone, we don't say, "Oh my God, that's an evil lion." We say, "Well, we may have to kill it, but it was just acting on its instinct."
right.
The ancient pagan gods, they were very scary. They could bless you. They could make you into a ruler of the entire city state,
Right.
or they could destroy you. They
Right.
could turn you into an animal, rob you of your humanity, which is what happens sometimes when the unconscious mind becomes too strong. When we are overwhelmed by primitive emotions of greed, anger, sexual arousal, it's possible that we can lose part of our humanity.
Mm,
Um, and so following Jung, I believe that when we read about magical creatures in mythology, folklore, fairy tales, when we read about things like numerology, the tarot, other mystical things, these are actually ways of understanding ourselves and the
mm-hmm.
hidden aspects of our being.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Um, I'm curious how you think what your thoughts are. Obviously, delving into the inner workings of the mind and the unconscious and conscious and all these things, and then you introduce something like a plant medicine or the molecule DMT, which is actually found well, widespread in nature and within ourselves, and yet it will cause a super conscious state in some regards. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about the introduction of something like DMT, for example.
I've got very mixed feelings about it.
Yeah.
Um, so, William James, very, very early psychologist, wrote about non ordinary states of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And we sometimes refer to them as numinous experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about how the veil of the ordinary is ripped away, and
Mm-hmm.
suddenly we see a deeper reality. Um, these are among, for many people, the most intense experiences of life. And there's an enormous amount we can learn from them. Now, psychedelic medicines create an intense numinous experience on demand.
Mm-hmm.
And there's part of me that worries about that.
Mm-hmm.
I've been a psychiatrist for many, many years, and I've done psychotherapy and I've given people medication. And one of the things I found is that shortcuts generally don't work.
Mm-hmm.
Shortcuts are kind of like buying things on a high interest credit card.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it feels good right now, but what you pay back is ultimately going to be greater than what it was that you
Mm-hmm.
got. And these psychedelic things seem like a shortcut. And so they make me nervous. They make me suspicious. On
Mm-hmm.
the flip side, though, the scientific evidence in terms of using them to treat people with mental illnesses is looking pretty fantastic.
Yeah.
People who have struggled to find
Yeah.
relief from depression, they've tried
Yep.
all kinds of treatments, nothing has worked. They do a single experience with psilocybin,
Yep.
and it revolutionizes it. So I'm going to withhold judgment.
Mm-hmm.
The Puritan in me wants to say, hey, you shouldn't be getting enlightenment from a pill.
Mm-hmm.
But the clinician in me says, hey, if it works, it works. Let's help people.
Yeah, and that is an understandable perspective, I would say. And like, to my point earlier, what results does it get?
Yeah.
And like the gods that can go either way, too much water is bad for me. And so, I think it was Terrence McKenna, I believe, that said, if you get the message, hang up the phone, in reference to psychedelics or plant medicines. So
Tell me more what you think he meant by that.
Well, what I think he meant is, as someone who's had a lot of experience in those realms, you get to a point where it's like, okay, I've gotten what I can out of this.
I see.
And so now by continuing, am I doing this to enhance or escape? I think is a good question to pose to yourself. Yeah. What is the intention going in? And so I've personally seen so many people. If I had a nickel for every time someone said I did psilocybin, it completely changed my life in the best way possible, I could retire. So, and I'm not using psilocybin regularly. I found it was really beneficial to me at one time, and it doesn't have the same positive effect that it once did for me personally. And I would personally recommend it to almost anyone who's considering exploring it. And certainly there could be a case where this isn't a good person to do it. It's not a cure-all. It's not but there's some really fascinating things, especially if you've had a lot of these experiences, that can open up where it's like the veil is so thinned in a way. It's kind of like, here's a glimpse. It doesn't mean you do this all day, every day, but you once you've kind of seen something, you can't unsee it, and it gives you something to, I fully agree. Ultimately, finding that path to spiritual connection, enlightenment, whatever you're seeking, it's a tool, and don't abuse the tool.
It kind of gives you a peek of the end goal. This is what you're working for. This is not the final way of getting it. But here's a little sneak peek at just how deep and meaningful it can be. And now, good luck. Struggle through life, try and achieve it on your own.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. It's kind of like near-death experiences. Mm-hmm. A lot of people have that sort of takeaway from near-death experience. They're shown beyond the veil. It feels to them very real, sometimes more real than this reality from, firsthand accounts I've heard. And then they come back and there's a sense of depression and, so it's not for the faint of heart, any of it.
Yeah, and I believe that the natural DMT that is in our brain is released shortly before death as people are dying. And some of the near-death experiences we hear about among people who didn't actually die, those may be DMT experiences.
Yeah, right. It's which is really interesting. I mean, by the way, I want to correct myself. I believe it was Alan Watts that said, if you get the message, hang up the phone. I've heard it theorized that our whole reality is potentially just a DMT trip. And that's a really interesting thought. Or the idea, I saw something the other day where it's like, you see the as above, so below reflections of atoms, and then you know look at the macrocosm, microcosm, and it's like, this looks really familiar. The sun with the things spinning around it, and it's like, are we maybe just a atom in the brain of a larger being, which isn't, it's like,
There's a wonderful thing showing a scan of some brain cells with all their filaments connecting one another right next to a picture of the universe with all the filaments of stars,
Yep.
and they look exactly the same.
It's the fractal nature of the universe is really like, it's to me, that's a great scientific reflection of this idea, the spiritual concept that, you and I are, the consciousness that animates my form is the consciousness that animates your form, I believe. I'm curious what you think. The separation between us is actually illusory in nature. So it's a relative truth. You and I are separate. We can make that argument. You and I are one from the perspective of what I just said. I believe that to be a deeper truth. And so I'm curious what you think about consciousness and the connectedness of consciousness through all life.
Yeah, yeah. So I would say, let's hold both of those ideas without making a value judgment. I would say that the idea that we are separate is a rational, logical, conscious conclusion. The idea that we are one is a mystical, unconscious conclusion. And one of the points that Carl Jung makes is that the conscious and the unconscious are complementary. And they can often appear to be opposites and at odds with one another. But if you look at it closely in a more sophisticated way, they actually complement and complete one another.
Right.
So we are both separate and connected. And if we can transcend that apparent division, that apparent conflict, that's kind of the goal of life, is achieving that transcendence where the opposites unite.
Right. And yeah, I definitely believe personally that we're in, the physical dimension, plane of existence that we're, dialoguing in this moment is, it's meant to be a duality. It's you've got the poles, you've got hot, cold, male, female. Speaking of Alan Watts, I saw him talking not so long ago in a little clip online, and it was showing the yin yang system. He goes, pretend like this is a black fish and this is a white fish, and they're at odds with each other. But then the white fish finally devours the black fish. Well, now there's no white fish anymore because there's no contrast or context for it to mean anything at all. And it's right. Neil Donald Walsh, who was on the show recently, said it very well. He said, in the absence of that which you are not, that which you are is not. And
that's one of the reasons why it's so hard for the conscious mind to understand the archetypes, because the archetypes contain their own opposites and contradictions. So, for example, if you look at Venus, the goddess of love, who symbolizes the archetype of love, what could be more wonderful than love? But also, what could be more terrible than love? How many people have committed suicide as a result of being in love? And the word venom, poison, comes from the same Latin root as Venus for love.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Yeah. It's like this idea of, falling in love is almost, how's it said? Falling in love, choose someone that you're willing to get, your heart broken over, essentially, because that's going to be some level of the experience, and it goes along with what we're saying.
I can't hold back, and I want to say, choose someone to fall in love. What utter nonsense.
Yeah.
Do we choose who we fall in love?
Yeah, that's true.
Our unconscious chooses who we fall in love with.
True.
Sometimes it makes a great choice. We marry that person and they emotionally support us and back us up for the rest of our life. Sometimes the unconscious, I'm not going to say makes a bad choice, but makes a choice that appears to be incredibly destructive. But I think that when the unconscious makes somebody fall in love with somebody who is horrible for them, it does it in the service of growth. That this person needed to have their heart broken, needed to have their life turned upside down for whatever reason. But we don't choose who we fall in love with.
Well,
That's for sure.
yeah, I agree with that, and to add to that, however, you know, in a sense, we're choosing energetically, I believe, because I believe that which is like unto itself is drawn. Water seeks its own level, so to speak, right? So whoever you are attracted to unconsciously is actually a result of where you're at in your whole journey vibrationally. And so it's a reflection in some way, shape, or form, because there is no out there. So you're okay. And I can look at my own journey as, you know, I'm 48 years old. I've never been married and had mostly been in relationships my whole life. So, you know, probably not the most standard journey compared to the average person. And so what I can see, though, as I would look back on that now, I started my first serious girlfriend at 15 years old. And it's like, as I developed and did the work on myself and grew, what I was unconsciously attracted to was an ever increasing match that made sense in those chapters as a reflection of who I was, where I was. And of course, the end goal, I believe, of all relationship is growth. I believe that's what our soul is doing. It's not about, you know, this misconception, it's got to last forever in order to be successful. It's actually souls come together as an opportunity for growth because they're a close enough vibrational match. And once that opportunity for maximum growth potential has, you know, played itself out, a natural separation occurs because our human self, it gets attached and habitual. And so we try and hang on to something that is sort of past its expiration date. And a lot of times we can't understand the hows and whys of it, and why do things feel different. And it's like, you know, your soul, I believe your higher self it's a dance that you're co-creating your experience with. And when you're at odds with it, that's when things can get really painful.
Yeah. It's very, very complicated. I agree with you 100% that the law of life is growth. And in fairy tales, we often see people petrified, turned to stone as a punishment for hanging on to something too tightly. With relationships, I think there's different ways it can go. You know, we can say, you know what, this relationship was great at this time of life. It's not great at this time of life. But I think that other people would say, well, let's see if the relationship can grow along with the participants. And sometimes people who are tempted to end the relationship will go into couples therapy and they'll find something they did not expect. Just a little pitch for couples therapy in my business.
Yeah, you know, I can say me and my own, you know, we're coming up on, as of this recording, and this will probably be released soon thereafter. We had an event. I run a co-living and event space in LA with my partner. And we split on Valentine's Day of last year, when the morning of a huge love party event that was happening at the house. And it was like, we look back on it now and we split, and we ended up, it actually led to us, you know, obviously reversing course a few days later and working through it, and we're way better for it. But it's, you know, it was one of those things, even the you know, feeling into the split, and then even how she showed up and navigated that experience for those few days really led to, for me to be like, hold on, maybe this is premature. And
you saw something you'd never seen before, huh?
That's right. Right. That's exactly it. And so it's yeah, that's what that makes me think of. So I'm curious, Dan, for those who are like, okay, I understand my unconscious, you know, 500,000 to 1. A lot of this stuff we know is really embedded in the first, 6 years of life. A lot of our programming, they say. Would you agree with that? And
a lot of important
okay,
things
that's
happen.
part one of the question. That's part one of the question. And then, regardless of your answer, how does one start to shift their unconscious from your perspective?
Right.
Or bring it conscious, make it conscious.
Yeah, a lot of incredibly important things happen early in life. Our brains are constantly changing, constantly developing. but it never happens more quickly than it does early on in life, when the brain is
Yep. Yep.
absolutely remodeling itself. I tell you, though, one of the revolutionary ideas of Carl Jung, though, is this idea that we are born with some pre-existing ideas, the archetypes. And he referred to it as the collective unconscious. He said,
Mm.
look, every human being has two arms, two legs, one nose, two lungs, a liver, pair of kidneys, et cetera, et cetera. Our physical anatomies are all very, very similar. Why would we expect our brains to be any different? And so we are born with these themes that we see arise in the folklore and culture all around the world, of cultures that did not have connections. We see stories that are remarkably similar, almost identical, because of this shared body of psychological inheritance. Um, so he believed that the goal of life was to make the unconscious conscious, thereby healing the split. We start out completely unconscious. Infants are unconscious, and we develop the ability to think rationally, logically, and deliberately very, very slowly. Rational thinking doesn't begin until I think age 7 or 8,
Mm.
and it's not fully complete until our early 20s.
Yeah.
So, the first part of life, our job is to split off the consciousness from the unconscious. In psychology, it's called the ego. Ego can have a negative connotation in common language, but in psychology, it's neutral. It's just
Yep.
I. It's the Latin word for I. So, when we're young, our job is to establish an independent ego that can act separately from our instincts, from our impulses. So we're not always acting without thinking. We're able to use rational deliberation. Once we do that, the reverse happens. Now our job is to open up to that unconscious. Now we're strong enough and independent enough to face it as an equal. And now we want to try to integrate our unconscious without being overwhelmed by it. And
Mm.
there's different strategies we can use. I think the strategy you mentioned is the most important, and that is pay attention. Try to be aware of your emotions, and try to allow them to occupy your mind, occupy your awareness without identifying with them.
Mm-hmm.
So you can say, I feel angry, not I am angry. I
Mm-hmm.
feel incredibly angry. I'm going to allow this feeling to occupy my mind because I want to have a good relationship with my unconscious, but I'm not going to act on it. And
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the, if I can use the word, magical things about consciousness. Instincts are drives that must be expressed.
Mm-hmm.
Animals have only one way of expressing instinctual drives, and that is to act on them. But human
Mm-hmm.
beings have two ways. We can either
Mm.
act on them or simply be aware of them with our
Mm.
conscious mind. And
Mm.
so being aware of these very negative, destructive impulses does two wonderful things. One, we don't have to act on them. By acknowledging them and allowing them to occupy our thoughts, we don't have to act on them. And the
Mm.
second is that they carry treasure with them. They carry
Mm.
gifts of energy and inspiration, and even things like love, the ability to connect with other people.
Mm-hmm.
So the most important way is to just get comfortable allowing whatever comes up to occupy your mind, taking a step back, not acting on it, but observing it. And
Mm.
and then I think another important way is we go to school and we learn the laws of nature. We learn about gravity and electromagnetism and light and all of those wonderful things. So important. So important to understand and cultivate the rational conscious mind. But I think we neglect the other side. We don't really have a lot of education in the mystical traditions, folklore, fairy tales, mythology, literature, poetry, opera, art, all of these things. I think we need to make up for the deficiencies of modern education, fill in the gaps, and come to realize the richness these things can bring to our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, yeah, I love that. It makes me think of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle.
Love it. I
And
absolutely
yeah,
love it.
yeah, it's
There's so
for
much
a very good
wisdom.
reason. Yeah, for a very good reason. I think it is one of the most popular books of recent decades. And yeah, once you get the idea that you are not your, you know, emotions or thoughts, and you start looking at them more of like creating that separation, right? And allowing, it's like clouds going by and allowing them to be, not fighting, not repressing, not resisting. Or like another teacher that I like, Esther Hicks, talks about, you know, you're not going to, if you're having a negative thought or emotion or feeling, you're not going to go from one end of the spectrum to the other just by, okay, never mind, I'm not mad at all and I'm feeling blissed out. You know, that's unrealistic. But what you can do is start to reach for a more neutral thought, and just kind of you kind of, you know, momentum. It's like, is it happens one way or another typically, right? And so you kind of stop it from the momentum building. It's much easier to hop off the train when it's just starting to go versus it's, you know, miles down the track and at full speed. So okay, well maybe there's another conscious perspective I can offer here. That's just, you know, once again, I'm not going to be blissed out over this thing that I don't like, but you know, here's a little more neutral thought, and just sort of navigate yourself consciously in that way. I found is really helpful.
Yeah, and again, getting to the magician-like quality of the conscious mind. Very negative things can be transformed into positive things.
Yeah,
If you think about anger, what is it that usually makes us angry? Well, I would say it's the feeling that we're being treated unfairly.
yeah,
There's nothing that makes us more angry than injustice.
yeah.
How can that be a good thing? Well, if we become aware of our emotional reactions to being treated unfairly, it gives us a deeper insight into the nature of justice. And it also gives us greater empathy into what it must be like for other people when they're treated in unjust ways, and maybe can help us be a more just person. So,
Mhm.
ironically, anger, which wants to go out and destroy things and hurt people, by simply being tolerated and accepted, can transform us into being someone who wants to go out and help people.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. That's a great share, great perspective. As we sort of start to wind down a bit here, I'd love to shift gears just a little bit. And one of the things that I love to hear from all of my guests is an inspiring story, if they have one. Typically, they do. I ask for, you know, a story of synchronicity or serendipity or a positive paranormal story, and curious if you have anything fun and inspiring to share.
You know, I don't know if this is exactly what you're looking for, but when I remember being a child and having numinous experiences. And I remember one in particular, just simply walking down the sidewalk half a block from my home. And all of a sudden, I felt like I was in fairyland. Um,
Hmm.
Everything around me looked exactly the same, but it was more real. It was
Hmm.
as if this hazy veil of the ordinary had been torn
Did you eat
away.
some mushrooms on the way, maybe?
I think I was about 6 or 7 years old. So no,
Okay,
no
maybe not.
mushrooms. But yeah, and it was intensely exciting and pleasurable. And I decided that the purpose of my life was to figure out what had happened and how I get into this world
Wow.
on a permanent
Wow.
basis. And so I remember being in sixth grade and going to the school library and asking for a book on magic. And they were giving me books about magic. And I said, no, I want a
Tricks.
book on
Yeah,
magical
yeah.
spells. And they're like, well, that's not real. And I was like, wow, they don't know because I
Yeah,
know
right.
that it is. So I
Oh,
think that
wow.
I
Wow.
can trace my interest um, magic and fairy tales and ultimately psychology and the unconscious mind, all the way back to that numinous experience as a child.
Wow, what a cool and early experience. Obviously, to be talking about it all these decades later was very profound. How long did the experience last for you?
It only lasted perhaps about 10 or 20 seconds.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but it
Wow.
was so intense that it became the pole star of my life in some ways.
Wow. It sounds to me like you were shown a glimpse behind the veil. And I think of, the one Bible quote that I like to, well, I kind of paraphrase it, but unless you become like a child, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
And so you were a child, and then you're tapping into this, this is absolutely fairy tale magic land. And you're feeling all the energies that go along with that, just not in concept, but as if you're truly in a magical land, right? And what a trip.
And I noticed that those things stopped happening when I was in my 20s and 30s and 40s. And I think the reason is that my mind knew, okay, now is the time when you've got to establish your rational ego. You shouldn't be playing footsie with the unconscious at this point in your life.
Yeah.
And then as I entered to my 50s, it started happening again. It's like, okay, now you've established that independent ego. Now you can open the door and you can start going back there.
So it's happening again.
It's happening again. Yeah. And you hear a lot about that as people get older, they suddenly get these incredibly vivid memories of childhood. That the door opens again into seeing the world as a child. It needed to be closed during early and middle adulthood. Once you reach later adulthood, though, it becomes safe to open it again. And in many ways, it's a rejuvenation of life.
Yeah, very, very inspiring. Well, I'm happy to hear that you're having those experiences again, and who knows? Perhaps you'll just slip in and never come out.
That would be pretty wonderful.
Wow. Well, this has been pretty wonderful, and I know some of the listeners would love to check out your book and connect. Follow your journey as it continues on in your fairy tale creation that you are co-creating with something. And what is the best way for people to
probably Amazon, Barnes and Noble's local bookstore, Spellbound, Modern Science, Ancient Magic, and the Hidden Potential of the Unconscious Mind.
Cool. Well, I do have one final question for you, and it is this. My cliche closer. In 60 seconds or less, what is the meaning of life according to Daniel Lieberman?
I think the meaning of life is expanding our capacity to love. That is the deepest, most important, most powerful thing that we are capable of. And that capacity is infinite. We can never, ever reach the finish line. It involves suffering and sacrifice and ecstasy and joy, all of the things that being human entails.
Yeah, I love that. It makes me think of my John Lennon remix quote I put in my own book. Love is the answer now. What was the question? So thanks for that answer, and thanks for taking the time to share your wisdom and all the work that you do in the world. This has been such a pleasure, and all of you listeners for tuning in your beautiful brainwaves and incredible hearts and unconscious mind. Hopefully got some good stuff in this episode. And until next time, journey well.
Thanks so much. It's been great being here.